My biology teacher looked us in the eyes as the carbon monoxide alarms blared and told us to sit back down. The midterm was worth 80% of our grade, and she said anyone who walked out that door would get a 0. She then locked it with a padlock as the first student's nose began to bleed. The hum of the fluorescent lights in Miss Wellington's biology class was a familiar, monotonous drone, a sound I had long associated with a slow, creeping paralysis of boredom. I was drifting in that hazy space between consciousness and sleep, my cheek pressed against the cool, smooth surface of the lab table, when a sudden, jarring noise ripped me back to reality. A voice, tinny and distorted, erupted from the intercom speaker on the wall, crackling with an urgency that instantly put every nerve on high alert. Attention, all students and staff. This is an immediate evacuation order. Gas line rupture confirmed in Building C. Potentially lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide detected. Evacuate the premises immediately. The words hung in the air, sharp and terrifying. This wasn't one of our sluggish, practiced fire drills. The sheer panic in the announcer's voice was unmistakable. This was real. A wave of primal fear washed over the classroom, and survival instinct took over. Chairs scraped violently against the linoleum floor as 30 students simultaneously shot to their feet, a single thought ricocheting through our minds: get out. But as we surged toward the door like a panicked herd, our escape was cut short. Miss Wellington, moving with a speed that defied her usual lethargic pace, planted herself directly in the doorway, her body a rigid, unyielding barrier. She wore an expression I knew all too well, a tightening of the jaw and a narrowing of the eyes that appeared only when she perceived a challenge to her absolute authority. "Nobody is leaving this classroom," she declared, her voice as cold and hard as steel. "We are in the middle of a project." Her tone was that of a perpetually annoyed DMV employee, laced with a sense of righteous indignation. There was no evacuation drill scheduled for today. I found my voice, a tremor of disbelief in it. "Miss Wellington," the announcement. She cut me off, her gaze sweeping over us with undisguised contempt. "This is a pathetic, transparent excuse to skip my class. I've seen it all before. Now, every single one of you will return to your seats, or you will all receive a 0 on the midterm." The threat landed with the force of a physical blow. The midterm? It was the monster lurking at the end of the semester, a single test that accounted for a staggering 80% of our final grade. A wave of indecision washed over the class, the instinct to flee warring with the ingrained fear of academic failure. Defeated, we shuffled back to our desks. As we sat, stewing in a cocktail of fear and resentment, Miss Wellington launched into one of her signature tirades. It was a rambling, bitter monologue about the laziness of our generation, the corrupting influence of phones and iPads, and the superior work ethic of her own youth. That was the central paradox of Miss Wellington. She was a drill sergeant when it came to enforcing her arbitrary rules, but was as lazy as Patrick Star when it came to her actual duties. She would gleefully mark an answer wrong on a test, even if it was factually correct, simply because you hadn't followed her convoluted, proprietary method for solving the problem. Yet, she would then stumble through an entire lesson, completely unprepared, reading directly from the textbook in a monotone drone because she hadn't bothered to prepare a lesson plan. We'd once orchestrated a small, silent rebellion, with the entire class pretending to have forgotten what page we were on, just to see if she had any clue what she was supposed to be teaching. We wasted the entire period as she aimlessly flipped through the textbook, a lost look on her face. Her rant was mercifully interrupted as she stepped away from the door for a moment to snatch her attendance clipboard from her desk. In that brief window, the intercom crackled to life again, the voice now strained and bordering on a full-blown scream. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Carbon monoxide levels are now critical. Risk of explosion is imminent. Evacuate Building C now." Instead of spurring her to action, the heightened warning brought a smug, condescending smile to Miss Wellington's face. "Oh, please," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "They're just being overly dramatic to scare you. Carbon monoxide doesn't explode. It's an odorless, colorless gas. That's basic high school chemistry, which you should all know by now. A girl in the front row, whose father was a chemical engineer, spoke up, her voice trembling but firm. That's not true. If there's a natural gas leak at the same time, the carbon monoxide can mix with it, and the combination is highly explosive. Miss Wellington's smile vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. That's enough, she snapped. Anyone who walks through that door fails this semester. No exceptions. Imagine how thrilled your parents will be when they have to explain that to your prospective colleges. With that, she repositioned herself in the doorway, crossing her arms like a bouncer at a low-rent nightclub. Besides, she added, a note of finality in her voice, if there really was a dangerous level of carbon monoxide in here, we would already be feeling the effects. We'd be dizzy, maybe even unconscious. You all look perfectly fine to me. Her words, illogical as they were, had their intended effect. The fear of a ruined GPA, of angry parents and rescinded college acceptances was a powerful deterrent. One by one, we slumped back into our chairs, a heavy silence falling over the room. That's when the first sign appeared. Rick, a quiet kid who sat near the back, suddenly tilted his head forward, and a dark trickle of blood began to seep from his nostril. A moment later, Mackenzie, a straight-A student, dropped her head onto her desk with a low groan, complaining of a splitting headache. The intercom screamed again, the speaker distorting the sound into a raw, desperate plea. Building C, evacuate immediately. Emergency services are en route. This is your final warning. A dull, heavy throbbing started behind my own eyes, a strange pressure building in my sinuses. I glanced out the window, and a knot of ice formed in my stomach. The entire school, every student from every other building, was assembled on the far side of the football field, a sea of anxious faces staring back at our building. Every other classroom was dark and empty. We were the only ones left, a single island of light in a sea of darkness. Miss Wellington, look, I yelled, pointing out the window. She took a single, cursory glance outside and, with a completely straight face, said, "It's just the gym classes." My jaw dropped. Outside, I could see our principal, Mr. Davison, pacing frantically on the lawn, his phone pressed to his ear. He was pointing directly at our classroom window, his face a mask of pure panic. The first wail of sirens cut through the air as fire trucks began to pull into the school parking lot. In response, Miss Wellington strode over to the windows and snapped the blinds shut. "We need to avoid distractions," she said coolly. "And as punishment for this little stunt, you can all enjoy a surprise pop quiz." She went to her desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of papers. The moment she placed the quiz in front of Jenny, a pale, sickly look washed over the girl's face, and she vomited all over the paper. The situation was spiraling into a nightmare. I watched in horror as my friend Mike, who sat 2 rows ahead of me, suddenly went limp. His body slumped forward, and he slid out of his chair, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. He was completely unconscious. That was the breaking point. The fragile dam of our fear and obedience finally burst. I stood up, my legs shaking, and started for the door. A half-dozen other students followed my lead. But Miss Wellington was faster. She got to the door first, and this time she didn't just block it. She pulled a heavy, rusted padlock and a chain from her oversized handbag and locked the door from the inside. "This little coordinated performance is truly Oscar-worthy," she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did you all rehearse this on TikTok? The fake fainting, the vomiting, you'll do anything to get out of my class, won't you?" Our phones began to buzz and chime incessantly, a frantic chorus of notifications. My mom texted, "The news is reporting a carbon monoxide leak at your school. Are you okay? Tell me you're safe." Then a text from my boyfriend in Building A. "We all evacuated. The whole school is out here. Where are you? Are you safe?" The sirens outside intensified, but the sound had changed. It was no longer the familiar wail of a fire truck. It was a deep, resonant horn, a specific alarm I'd heard only in movies, the hazmat siren, reserved for situations that were about to go catastrophically wrong. "This is obviously a plot by the administration," Miss Wellington announced to the terrified room, a wild, paranoid look in her eyes. "They're trying to sabotage my tenure review. They know I have the highest standards and, consequently, the highest fail rate. They want me gone, so they've staged this elaborate, ridiculous hoax." Mackenzie, who had been cradling her head in her hands, shot to her feet. "Did you get special training to become this stupid, or are you just a natural?" she screamed, her voice raw with fury. "Young lady, that is a detention," Miss Wellington began, but Mackenzie cut her off. "My dad is a firefighter," she yelled, her voice echoing in the tense room. "That's the catastrophic leak siren. That's the one they use when a building is about to blow. We need to leave right now. Sit down, Mackenzie, or I'll have you expelled." Miss Wellington shrieked, but Mackenzie wasn't listening. She grabbed a heavy metal lab stool, hoisted it over her head, and brought it crashing down against the reinforced window. The glass shuddered and cracked but didn't break. A primal, collective roar went up from the rest of the class, as everyone seemed to have the same idea at once. More students grabbed stools and anything else heavy they could find, joining Mackenzie in her assault on the window. Miss Wellington screamed at us to stop, her voice a shrill, powerless shriek against the chaos. The thick safety glass finally gave way, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The moment it broke, fresh, clean air rushed into the room, a stark contrast to the thick, heavy atmosphere we had been breathing. Half the class scrambled out of the broken window, dropping to the grass below. The other half, myself included, rushed to the students who had passed out, dragging their limp bodies toward the opening and handing them off to the students outside. By the time the last of us was out, we saw flames erupting from the roof of Building D, a separate structure no more than 100 feet away from our classroom. 8 of my classmates were unconscious, victims of severe carbon monoxide poisoning. 3 of them were in critical condition and would be rushed to the ICU. The last thing I saw as I was being led away by a paramedic was a team of firefighters in full gear climbing through the broken window of our classroom to physically carry a screaming, protesting Miss Wellington out of the building she had nearly turned into our tomb. But here's the most twisted part of the story, the detail that never made the evening news. The security footage from the night before the incident showed Miss Wellington in the school basement at 2 in the morning, standing near the main gas lines. And when the investigators finally searched her desk to understand why she would lock us in a room to die, they found something that explained everything. While Miss Wellington was still being restrained, screaming about conspiracies and setups, a firefighter was systematically going through the drawers of her desk. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, and as he smoothed it out, his entire demeanor changed. "Chief," he called out, his voice grim, "you need to see this." It was a formal letter from the school district, dated 2 days prior. It was her tenure denial. But it wasn't just crumpled. The margins were filled with frantic, desperate scribbles in red ink. Notes about needing this job, about having nothing and no one left, about how they couldn't do this to her after 15 years of service. The page was covered in frantic calculations, bills circled and added up over and over. Numbers that stubbornly refused to add up no matter how she arranged them. Just then, Riley Evans, the school's elderly janitor, approached one of the detectives, wringing his hands, his face pale and sick-looking. "Detective, there's something I have to tell you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Last week, Miss Wellington, she was asking me all these strange questions about the gas lines in Building C, real specific stuff like where the shut-off valves were and how the ventilation system worked. I figured she was planning some kind of new science demonstration, but now," he trailed off, his gaze fixed on our classroom, where paramedics were still carefully lifting students through the shattered window. The detective pulled out his phone and played a grainy security video. "This is from 2 nights ago, just after 2 a.m., he explained. The footage showed Miss Wellington standing outside the utility room in the basement of Building C. She just stood there, completely still, staring at the door for a full 10 minutes. Then she turned and walked away, only to return 5 minutes later holding a wrench she had apparently retrieved from her car. She stared at the door for another few minutes, then finally turned and left for good. Well, that's not suspicious at all. Mackenzie muttered sarcastically from beside me. When the detectives showed Miss Wellington the video, she completely lost what little composure she had left. That's fake. They edited that footage. It's a setup, she shrieked, lunging at the detective in an attempt to snatch his phone. It took two burly firefighters to restrain her as she was dragged, kicking and screaming, toward a waiting police car. I was protecting them, she wailed. I was protecting my students from a fake drill. I was sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, an oxygen mask strapped to my face, the plastic taste filling my mouth, when my mom's car screeched into the parking lot. She bolted from the driver's seat without even closing the door, running toward me with a frantic desperation I had never seen before. She practically tore the ambulance door off its hinges, her hands immediately on my face, my arms, checking me over as if I might dematerialize before her eyes. Oh my God, oh my God, she kept repeating, the words choked by gut-wrenching sobs. She was crying too hard to form coherent sentences, just raw, broken sounds of terror and relief. A paramedic gently tried to explain that I was going to be okay, but she clung to me, refusing to let go. Nearby, they were loading Mike onto a stretcher. He was still unconscious, his face slack and pale. Just then, his parents' car pulled up, and his mother leaped out, already screaming his name. When she saw him on that stretcher, so still and unresponsive, a terrible, guttural wail escaped her lips, and she collapsed. Her husband had to catch her, holding her up as she sobbed uncontrollably. I had never heard a sound of such pure agony come from a human being. Mackenzie's dad, a captain at Station 12 across town, arrived moments later, still in his full firefighter gear. He hadn't even been on duty, but he'd heard the call on the radio and had driven there at 90 miles an hour. He saw Mackenzie and enveloped her in a hug so tight, I could hear the air rush from her lungs. "You broke the window?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion and cracking. "Yeah, Dad," she whispered. "That's my girl," he said, his voice breaking completely. "That's my brave girl." He was openly sobbing into her hair, this giant of a man, a decorated firefighter, completely undone by the thought of what he had almost lost. The news vans began to arrive then, descending on the scene like vultures. Suddenly, we were swarmed by reporters shoving microphones in our faces. "Can you tell us what happened? How long were you locked inside? Did the teacher intentionally endanger you?" A protective wall of parents instantly formed around us. Mackenzie's dad physically shoved one cameraman back. My mom pulled me behind her and snarled at a reporter, "Get the hell away from my child, or I'll shove that microphone somewhere you'll never find it." The hospital waiting room was a scene of pure chaos. Parents were screaming at anyone who looked like they were in a position of authority. The principal, school board members, lawyers in suits. "How does a teacher have the ability to lock children in a classroom during a gas leak?" one father roared. "My son could have died today." A doctor finally emerged from the emergency room, his face etched with exhaustion. The three students who were admitted to the ICU, Rick Morrison, Jenny Chun, and Mike Torres, are now in stable condition. We have them on hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Jenny experienced a seizure as a result of the carbon monoxide exposure, but her initial brain scans look promising. "We expect a full recovery." "Expect?" Jenny's mom asked, her voice small and fragile. "Carbon monoxide poisoning can be unpredictable," the doctor admitted gently. "But we are optimistic." The lead detective arrived at the hospital, a small digital recorder in his hand. He needed to get our official statements while the events were still fresh in our minds. "I need you to tell me everything," he said to me, especially about the threat she made regarding the midterm. I recounted the entire story, how she had said we'd get zeros, how the test was worth 80% of our grade, how she had physically blocked the door and then padlocked it. He made me repeat her exact words several times. "She's been acting strangely for weeks," I added. "She's been overly strict about small, meaningless things, but then completely unprepared for her actual lessons. Last week, she gave us a pop quiz on a chapter we hadn't even started yet, and then got angry at us when the entire class failed." I could hear Mackenzie giving her statement in the next room, her father by her side. When she got to the part where Miss Wellington called the evacuation a fake drill, I heard her dad's voice, low and dangerous. She said what? He asked, his voice quiet in a way that was far more terrifying than yelling. She said they were overselling it, Mackenzie replied. She said that carbon monoxide doesn't explode. Jesus Christ, her dad muttered. Basic chemistry, my ass. The next morning, my phone was flooded with texts from classmates. The local news was playing footage of Miss Wellington being arrested in the parking lot of her apartment complex. She was still wearing the same clothes from the day before, her hair a wild mess, and she was screaming at the news cameras. The school set me up. They wanted me gone. This was all their plan. Later that day, our principal, Mr. Davison, gave a press conference. He looked like he had aged a decade overnight. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes, and his voice trembled as he spoke. Effective immediately, the school will be closed for the remainder of the week to allow for a full safety review. We are cooperating fully with the police investigation. Someone from the press corps yelled out, "Why didn't you break down the door?" Mr. Davison just stared blankly, then turned and walked away from the podium without another word. That afternoon, Mike finally regained consciousness in the ICU. His mom sent a text to mine. He was disoriented and confused, with a headache so severe they had to keep the lights in his room turned off. But he was awake and he was talking. Jenny woke up the following day, but the ordeal had taken a different toll on her. She had no memory of the previous day at all. The gas leak, the evacuation, Miss Wellington locking the door, it was all a complete blank. The seizure had wiped her short-term memory clean. Her parents were told that the memories might return eventually, or they might not. Rick, meanwhile, was facing a different, more insidious problem. His nose wouldn't stop bleeding. The doctors discovered that the extreme exposure to carbon monoxide had triggered a rare, underlying blood disorder he never knew he had. His platelets weren't functioning properly, and he required multiple blood transfusions. His mom started a desperate plea on Facebook for blood donors. 3 days later, we were all summoned to the district office to give official statements to the school board's investigators. The building smelled of stale coffee and regret. They wanted to know every detail about Miss Wellington's behavior leading up to the incident. I told them about the almost daily pop quizzes, how it felt like she was actively trying to fail as many students as possible. Another student mentioned finding her asleep at her desk during her lunch break on several occasions. Someone else recalled that she had been wearing the same wrinkled blouse for 3 days straight. The lead fire investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Dahlia Hart, sat us down in a conference room. "We've learned that Miss Wellington was recently evicted from her apartment," she told us gently. She had been living in her car for the past 3 weeks. Her tenure denial meant she lost her eligibility for summer teaching and she couldn't make rent. Riley Evans was brought in to explain his findings. He showed us detailed photographs of the gas valve in the basement. "Someone definitely tampered with this," he said, pointing to a series of deep scratch marks on the metal. "But they clearly didn't know what they were doing. They were trying to force the valve closed, but they ended up bypassing the automatic safety mechanism. If they had just left it alone, the system would have detected the initial small leak and shut itself off automatically. So, she caused the major leak by trying to stop a minor leak that never even existed?" Mackenzie's dad asked in disbelief. "That's what it looks like," the investigator confirmed. The next morning, District Attorney Leandro held a press conference. After a thorough review of all the evidence, he announced, his face grim, "We are charging Mrs. Wellington with 8 counts of felony reckless endangerment and 8 counts of false imprisonment." A reporter shouted, "What's the maximum sentence she's facing?" Leandro replied, "Each endangerment charge carries a sentence of up to 5 years, and each false imprisonment charge carries up to 3. We're talking about a potential total of 64 years in prison." That afternoon, Miss Wellington had her arraignment via a video link from the county jail. She looked so small and frail in the oversized orange jumpsuit. Her lawyer, a sharp, composed woman named Abigail McLean, argued for bail. "Your Honor, my client was experiencing a severe mental health crisis brought on by extreme financial desperation. She had just lost her job, she had been evicted, and she was living in her car. She was not thinking clearly. The judge, an older woman with a stern but not unkind face, was unmoved. "Counselor, your client locked 8 children in a room that was actively filling with a poisonous gas. Mental health crisis or not, she remains a danger to the community. Bail is denied." On the screen, Miss Wellington began to sob, not with the angry, defiant tears of her arrest, but with broken, desperate gasps. "I never meant to hurt them," she whimpered. "I thought it was fake. Please, I thought it was fake." Then the screen went black. A week later, Jenny's parents filed the first lawsuit against the school district. Their lawyer held a press conference, waving a folder as thick as a phone book. The Chin family is seeking $10 million in damages. Jenny Chin suffered a catastrophic seizure that has resulted in permanent memory loss. She will require specialized medical care for the rest of her life. The school district was aware of Miss Wellington's instability. There were numerous warning signs, yet they chose to do nothing. By the end of the week, 7 more families, including mine, had filed similar lawsuits. The local news kept a running tally on screen, a morbid scoreboard of our collective trauma. Lawsuit total, $47 million and counting. The school's insurance company sent their own team of investigators, men in cheap suits with insincere smiles, who pulled us out of class one by one to ask us the same questions over and over. "Didn't Miss Wellington seem perfectly normal to you before this happened?" one of them asked me, his face a mask of feigned concern. "Define normal," I replied. "Was her behavior in the weeks leading up to the incident unusual for her?" he pressed. "She was always strange," I admitted. "But yes, the last few weeks were on another level." She gave us a quiz on material from 3 chapters ahead in the textbook, and then accused us of not paying attention when we all failed. He just nodded and scribbled in his little notebook as if he actually cared. The school board meeting that Thursday was an absolute circus. It had to be moved to the gymnasium to accommodate the hundreds of angry parents who showed up. The board members sat at a long table at the front, looking like they were facing a firing squad. "How is it possible that your emergency protocols can be overridden by a single teacher?" a father demanded, his face crimson with rage. "My daughter nearly died because of your incompetence." The board president, a woman who looked like she would rather be anywhere else on earth, just kept repeating the same hollow phrase over and over. "We are reviewing our procedures." Mackenzie's dad, in his full dress uniform, walked up to the microphone, and the entire gym fell silent. "I have been a firefighter for 18 years, he said, his voice calm and steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "In all my years of service, I have never, ever heard of a teacher locking students in a building during an emergency evacuation. Do you know why? Because it is an act of literal insanity. The fact that she was even capable of doing so means your entire system is a catastrophic failure." A smattering of applause started, then grew into a thunderous ovation. The board members just stared down at their hands. Then, they showed the other security footage, clips from the month leading up to the incident. There was Miss Wellington screaming at Riley Evans for mopping the hallway too close to her classroom. Another clip showed her sitting alone in the teacher's lounge at 11 p.m., just staring into space. In the most disturbing video, she was in her empty classroom, hurling textbooks against the wall, one after another, with a furious, desperate energy. The principal, his voice barely a whisper, admitted, "We had received 3 formal complaints about her behavior in the last 6 weeks. 2 from parents regarding unfair grading practices, and 1 from a substitute teacher who described her as hostile and erratic." "And you did nothing?" someone screamed from the crowd. We were following the union protocols for documentation before taking disciplinary action," he stammered. The gym erupted in a roar of outrage. The board members had to be escorted out through a back door by security. The next 2 weeks were a blur. Rick was finally discharged from the hospital, but he was pale and frail, a ghost of his former self. His mother posted that he now required daily injections that cost $800 each, and their insurance company was refusing to cover it, calling the treatment experimental. Mike's return to school was a disaster. During first period, someone accidentally dropped a heavy textbook, and Mike screamed and dove under his desk, convinced the building was exploding. He had a full-blown panic attack and had to be picked up by his mother. "I can't stop thinking we're trapped," he told me on the phone later that night. "Every time I'm in a classroom, I find myself mapping out the escape routes. I can't focus on anything else." Jenny's situation was different, but no less heartbreaking. She would be acting completely normal one moment, and then a cloud of confusion would pass over her face. "Wait, did we have homework for this class?" she asked me in English, 5 minutes after we had already turned it in. She would stare at her own completed assignment on the teacher's desk with no recognition. The worst part was when she would get frustrated and cry because she was aware that she was forgetting things, but was powerless to stop it. The school, in a desperate act of damage control, implemented a raft of new safety measures. They removed any lock that could potentially be used to trap someone inside a room. They painted all the emergency exits a garish neon yellow. They installed emergency panic buttons in every classroom that were wired directly to the 911 dispatch center. Miss Wellington's preliminary hearing felt like a media circus. They made us testify one by one. I was first. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the microphone. I told the court exactly what she had said about the 0 on the midterm, about failing the semester. "And you believed her?" the prosecutor asked. "She was our teacher," I said, my voice small. "We were taught our whole lives to listen to our teachers." Her lawyer tried to paint us as delinquent students. "Isn't it true," she asked me on cross-examination, "that you and your classmates often engaged in disruptive behavior to get out of Miss Wellington's class?" Mackenzie's dad stood up in the gallery and shouted, "Are you seriously trying to blame the children?" The judge banged her gavel, but the damage was done. Several jury members were glaring at the defense attorney. When Mackenzie took the stand, she was cold and composed. "I knew we were dying," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "My dad taught me the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning: headache, nausea, confusion. We were all experiencing them. So I broke the window." "You could have injured your classmates with flying glass," the defense lawyer countered. Mackenzie stared at her. "They would have been dead if I hadn't." The judge ruled that there was more than enough evidence to proceed with a full trial. As they let a sobbing Miss Wellington out of the courtroom, she kept wailing, "I was just trying to maintain order. I was doing my job." 2 agonizing months later, the principal sent out a school-wide email announcing his retirement. "I cannot in good conscience continue in this role, knowing that I failed to protect the students in my care," he wrote. "Every day, I am haunted by what would have happened if those brave students hadn't broken that window." His replacement, Priscilla Odom, was a force of nature. On her first day, she called a mandatory all-staff meeting. "Every single employee in this building will undergo and pass a new, rigorous emergency response training program. Refusal will result in immediate termination. There will be no exceptions and no union protection. The safety of our children trumps everything." 3 teachers quit on the spot. "We started having monthly evacuation drills for every conceivable disaster. Any teacher who didn't have their class evacuated within 90 seconds was formally written up. A second offense meant suspension. There was no third offense." 3 months after the incident, the district finally agreed to pay for therapy sessions for the affected students. The 4 of us, Mike, Jenny, Rick, and I, sat in a circle with a therapist who spoke in a soft, gentle voice. "I keep smelling gas," Mike admitted, his leg bouncing nervously. "Even when I know there's no gas, I smell it everywhere." "That's a classic trauma response," the therapist explained. "Your brain is trying to protect you by remaining hypervigilant." "Great," Mike muttered. "So my brain is broken." Rick showed us the track marks and bruises on his arms from the daily injections. "The doctors say it might be 6 more months of treatment, or it might be a year, or it might be forever. They don't know." Jenny barely spoke. When the therapist asked her how she was feeling, she just shrugged. "I don't remember feeling anything. I don't remember that day at all. Sometimes, it feels like everyone is playing an elaborate prank on me. Then I see the news reports, and it's like I'm watching a movie about someone else's life." The trial began 4 months after the incident. The courthouse was packed every day. They had to set up video feeds in overflow rooms. The prosecution brought in the actual gas valve as evidence, a twisted piece of metal covered in tool marks. Riley Evans testified again, explaining in simple terms how the defendant's incompetent tampering had turned a minor issue into a potential catastrophe. Miss Wellington, looking gaunt and frail after months in jail, finally took the stand. "I smelled something strange a few nights before the incident," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought if I could fix it myself, it would show initiative. I thought it might help with my tenure review." "So you tampered with a high-pressure gas line, with no training or understanding of the equipment," the prosecutor thundered. "I was trying to help," she cried. "You were trying to save your job, and in doing so, you nearly cost 8 children their lives." The prosecutor then displayed her bank records on a large screen for the jury to see. Car payments 3 months overdue. An eviction notice. Maxed out credit cards. "You were desperate, weren't you, Mrs. Wellington? Desperate enough to do anything to keep your job." "It was all I had left," she whispered. "So, when the evacuation alarm sounded, you panicked. You thought a disruption would look bad on your record?" "I thought it was a test," she insisted, her voice cracking. "I thought the administration was testing me to see if I could maintain classroom control." Even after multiple announcements stating it was a real, life-threatening emergency? "I wasn't thinking clearly," she sobbed. "No," the prosecutor said, his voice cold. "You were thinking very clearly. You were thinking about yourself and only yourself." The defense called a psychiatrist who spoke about acute stress-induced decision paralysis and dissociative episodes, showing the jury complex brain scans. Essentially, he said, Mrs. Wellington's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making, was offline. The prosecutor rose. "Doctor, are you saying your professional opinion is that she didn't understand that locking children in a room filling with carbon monoxide was dangerous?" "I'm saying she was in a mental state where she couldn't process that information correctly. But she could process the information that they would fail her midterm if they left, couldn't she?" The psychiatrist stammered, and a woman in the front row of the jury shook her head in disgust. The victim impact statements were brutal. Rick's mom held up a thick folder of medical bills. "My son requires an injection every single day," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Each one costs $800. Our insurance company calls it experimental. Do you know what I call it? Keeping my baby alive. He was a perfectly healthy boy before you locked him in that room." Mike's dad, a large, tough-looking construction worker, broke down on the stand. "He can't sleep through the night," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "He wakes up screaming that he's trapped. My son, who used to love school, now throws up from anxiety every single morning." You didn't just poison their bodies. You poisoned their minds. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman, an older man with a deep, steady voice, stood and declared, "On the 8 counts of reckless endangerment, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the 8 counts of false imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty." Miss Wellington didn't react. She just sat there, staring into nothingness, her face a blank mask. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, the judge did not hold back. "Miss Wellington, you are entrusted with the most sacred responsibility there is, the safety of children. And when you were faced with a choice between their lives and your job evaluation, you chose yourself. You turned a classroom into a gas chamber and used their grades as the lock. I hereby sentence you to 12 years in state prison." The school district settled all the lawsuits 2 months later. The exact figures were kept confidential, but the following semester, the school announced massive budget cuts, eliminating the music program, art classes, and all sports except for football and basketball. Everyone knew where the money had gone. 6 months after the incident, a local news station did a follow-up story. Mike, looking uncomfortable in his Letterman jacket, told the reporter, "I have panic attacks every day. I'm on 3 different medications just to be able to function." Jenny, reading from note cards because she couldn't trust her own memory, said, "I have to write everything down now. If I don't, it's just gone." My parents had to put labels on everything in our house, even on my own photographs. Rick held up his wrist, showing the camera his medical alert bracelet. The carbon monoxide permanently damaged my platelets, he said. If I get a serious injury, I could bleed to death. This bracelet might save my life one day. Mackenzie, accepted early to a prestigious university's emergency management program, said, I want people to know that we almost died because one person decided her job was more important than our lives. And if I hadn't broken that window, she trailed off, letting the unspoken horror hang in the air. On our last day as seniors, we did the traditional walkthrough of the school. When we passed Building C, now a construction site surrounded by barriers, a heavy silence fell over our group. They were completely gutting it, installing new ventilation systems, emergency exits every 30 feet, and windows that could be easily opened from the inside. The school had scrubbed every trace of Miss Wellington from its history. Her Teacher of the Year plaques were gone, her photo cut out of old yearbooks. It was as if she had never existed. After graduation, the 5 of us met at a coffee shop.
We didn't talk about that day.
We talked about college and summer plans. We talked about anything and everything else because we didn't need to talk about it. We had a shared bond, a scar that no one else could ever truly understand. You know what's weird? Mike said, stirring his coffee. I still have that pop quiz she handed out during the leak. It still has Jenny's puke stain on it. Why on earth would you keep that? I asked. At first, for evidence, he said with a shrug. But now, I don't know. I guess it's proof that it really happened. Sometimes, it still feels like a nightmare I just made up. It wasn't a nightmare, Jenny said quietly, staring into her cup. Even if I can't remember it. A few weeks later, while packing for college, I found my old biology notebook. It was filled with Miss Wellington's aggressive red pen marks and her nitpicking comments. I stood there for a moment, then walked it over to the trash can and dropped it in. Some things you just don't need to remember.